What do you? What do you? What do you?
Hello and welcome to our new video. Today we are going to talk about the First Crusade. The First Crusade, 1095-1099, was the first of a number of crusades that attempted to capture the Holy Land, called for by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in 1095. It started as a widespread pilgrimage of Western Christendom and ended as a military expedition by Roman Catholic Europe to regain the Holy Land taken in the Muslim conquests of the Levant, 632-661, ultimately resulting in the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. The crusade was initiated by appeal from Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who requested Western aid to help repel the invading Seljuk Turks from Anatolia. In response, Urban II called the Council of Clermont, and in November, officially declared a crusade. An additional goal became the principal objective: the Christian reconquest of the sacred city of Jerusalem and the Holy Land, and the freeing of the Eastern Christians from Muslim rule. The official Prince's Crusade was preceded by the unofficial People's Crusade, in which a number of peasants, led by Peter the Hermit, first slaughtered populations of Jews in Europe and then attacked Muslims in Anatolia, where they were decisively defeated. In 1096, the official Crusader armies, led by a number of Catholic rulers, departed for the Middle East. During the crusade, nobility, knights, peasants and serfs from many regions of Western Europe traveled over land and by sea, first to Constantinople and then on towards Jerusalem. They captured Nicaea in 1097 and took Antioch in 1098, where they massacred the occupants of the city. The Crusaders arrived at Jerusalem, launched an assault on the city, and captured it in July 1099, massacring many of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. During their conquests, the Crusaders established the Latin Rite Crusader states of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. This was contrary to the wishes of the Eastern Rite Byzantines, who wanted the land that the Muslims took from them returned, rather than occupied by Latin Catholics. After the retaking of Jerusalem, most of the Crusaders returned home. This left the Crusader kingdoms vulnerable from Muslim reconquests during the Second and Third Crusades. Origin. The origin of the Crusades in general, and particularly that of the First Crusade, is widely debated among historians. The confusion is partially due to the numerous armies in the First Crusade, and their lack of direct unity. The similar ideologies held the armies to similar goals, but the connections were rarely strong, and the unity broke down often. The Crusades are most commonly linked to the political and social situation in 11th century Europe, the rise of a reform movement within the papacy, and the political and religious confrontation of Christianity and Islam in Europe and the Middle East. Christianity had spread throughout Europe, Africa, and the Middle East in late antiquity, but by the early 8th century Christian rule had become limited to Europe and Anatolia after the Muslim conquests. The Umayyad Caliphate had conquered Syria, Egypt, and North Africa from the predominantly Christian Byzantine Empire, and Hispania from the Visigothic kingdom. In North Africa, the Umayyad Empire eventually collapsed and a number of smaller Muslim kingdoms emerged, such as the Achlabids, who attacked Italy in the 9th century. Pisa, Genoa, and the Principality of Catalonia began to battle various Muslim kingdoms for control of the Mediterranean basin, exemplified by the Mahdia campaign and battles at Majorca and Sardinia. Between the years of 1096 and 1101 the Byzantine Greeks experienced the Crusade as it arrived in Constantinople in 3 separate waves. In the early summer of 1096, the first large unruly group arrived on the outskirts of Constantinople. This wave was reported to be undisciplined and ill-equipped as an army. This first group is often called the Peasants or People's Crusade. It was led by Peter the Hermit and Walter Senz-Abuwar and had no knowledge of or respect for the wishes of Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. The second wave. The second wave was also not under the command of the emperor and was made up of a number of armies with their own commanders. Together, this group and the first wave numbered an estimated 60,000. The second wave was led by Hugh I, Count of Vermandois, the brother of King Philip I of France. Also among the second wave were Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse and the army of Provençals. It was this second wave of crusaders which later passed through Asia Minor, captured Antioch in 1098 and finally took Jerusalem July 15, 1099. The third wave, composed of contingents from Lombardy, France, and Bavaria, arrived in Jerusalem in the early summer of 1101. Situation in Europe. At the western edge of Europe and of Islamic expansion, the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula was well underway by the 11th century. It was intermittently ideological, as evidenced by the Codex Vigilanus compiled in 881. Increasingly in the 11th century, foreign knights, mostly from France, visited Iberia to assist the Christians in their efforts. Shortly before the First Crusade, Pope Urban II had encouraged the Iberian Christians to reconquer Tarragona, using much of the same symbolism and rhetoric that was later used to preach the Crusade to the people of Europe. The heart of Western Europe had been stabilized after the Christianization of the Saxon, Viking, and Hungarian peoples by the end of the 10th century. However, the breakdown of the Carolingian Empire gave rise to an entire class of warriors who now had little to do but fight among themselves. The random violence of the knightly class was regularly condemned by the Church, and in response it established the peace and truce of God to prohibit fighting on certain days of the year. At the same time, the reform-minded papacy came into conflict with the Holy Roman Emperors, resulting in the investiture controversy. Popes such as Gregory VII justified the subsequent warfare against the emperor's partisans in theological terms. It became acceptable for the Pope to utilize knights in the name of Christendom, not only against political enemies of the papacy, but also against Al-Andalus, or, theoretically, against the Seljuk dynasty in the east. To the east of Europe lay the Byzantine Empire, composed of Christians who had long followed a separate Orthodox rite. The Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches had been in schism since 1054. Historians have argued that the desire to impose Roman Church authority in the East may have been one of the goals of the Crusade, although Urban II, who launched the First Crusade, never refers to such a goal in his letters on crusading. The Seljuk Turks had taken over almost all of Anatolia after the Byzantine defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, however, their conquests were piecemeal and led by semi-independent warlords, rather than by the Sultan. A dramatic collapse of the empire's position on the eve of the Council of Clermont brought Byzantium to the brink of disaster. By the mid-1090s, the Byzantine Empire was largely confined to Balkan Europe and the northwestern fringe of Anatolia, and faced Norman enemies in the west as well as Turks in the east in response to the defeat at Manzikert and subsequent Byzantine losses in Anatolia in 1074. Pope Gregory VII had called for the Milites Christi, soldiers of Christ, to go to Byzantium's aid. This call was largely ignored and even opposed. The reason for this was that while the defeat at Manzikert was shocking, it had limited significance and did not lead to major difficulties for the Byzantine Empire, at least in the short term. Situation in the Middle East. Main article, Crusader states. Umayyad Caliphate at its greatest extent. Until the Crusaders' arrival, the Byzantines had continually fought the Seljuks and other Turkish dynasties for control of Anatolia and Syria. The Seljuks, who were Orthodox Sunni Muslims, had formerly ruled the Great Seljuk Empire, but by the time of the First Crusade it had divided into several smaller states after the death of Malik Shah I in 1092. Malik Shah was succeeded in the Anatolian Sultanate of Rum by Kilij Arslan I, and in Syria by his brother Tutush I, who died in 1095. Tutush's sons Fakhr al-Mulk Radwan and Dokak inherited Aleppo and Damascus respectively, further dividing Syria amongst emirs antagonistic towards each other, as well as Kurbagh, the Atabeg of Mosul. Egypt and much of Palestine were controlled by the Arab Shiite Fatimid Caliphate, which was significantly smaller since the arrival of the Seljuks. Warfare between the Fatimids and Seljuks caused great disruption for the local Christians and for Western pilgrims. The Fatimids, under the nominal rule of Caliph al-Mustali but actually controlled by Vizier Alafdal Shahan Shah, had lost Jerusalem to the Seljuks in 1073, although some older accounts say 1076, they recaptured it in 1098 from the Artukids, a smaller Turkish tribe associated with the Seljuks, just before the arrival of the Crusaders. Council of Clermont. Main article, Council of Clermont. Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont. Illustration from Sebastian Mamerit's Livre des Passages d'Outre-mer, Jean Colombi, c. 1472-75, BNF Father 5594. While the Crusades had causes deeply rooted in the social and political situations of 11th century Europe, the event actually triggering the First Crusade was a request for assistance from Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. Alexios was worried about the advances of the Seljuks, who had reached as far west as Nicaea, not far from Constantinople. In March 1095, Alexios sent envoys to the Council of Piacenza to ask Pope Urban II for aid against the Turks. Urban responded favorably, perhaps hoping to heal the Great Schism of 40 years earlier, and to reunite the Church under papal primacy by helping the Eastern churches in their time of need. Alexios and Urban had previously been in close contact in 1089 and after, and had discussed openly the prospect of the reunion of the Christian Church. There were signs of considerable cooperation between Rome and Constantinople in the years immediately before the Crusade. In July 1095, Urban turned to his homeland of France to recruit men for the expedition. His travels there culminated in the Council of Clermont in November, where, according to the various speeches attributed to him, he gave an impassioned sermon to a large audience of French nobles and clergy, graphically detailing the fantastical atrocities being committed against pilgrims and Eastern Christians. There are 5 versions of the speech recorded by people who may have been at the council: Baldric of Dole, Guibert of Nogent, Robert the Monk, and Fulcher of Chartres, or who went on crusade, Fulcher and the anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum, as well as other versions found in later historians, such as William of Malmesbury and William of Tyre. All of these versions were written after Jerusalem had been captured. Thus it is difficult to know what was actually said and what was recreated in the aftermath of the successful crusade. The only contemporary records are a few letters written by Urban in 1095. All 5 versions of the speech differ widely from one another in regard to particulars. All versions, except that in the Gesta Francorum, generally agree that Urban talked about the violence of European society and the necessity of maintaining the peace of God, about helping the Greeks, who had asked for assistance, about the crimes being committed against Christians in the East, and about a new kind of war, an armed pilgrimage, and of rewards in heaven, where remission of sins was offered to any who might die in the undertaking. They do not all specifically mention Jerusalem as the ultimate goal. However, it has been argued that Urban's subsequent preaching reveals that he expected the expedition to reach Jerusalem all along. According to one version of the speech, the enthusiastic crowd responded with cries of Deus vult. God wills it. However, other versions of the speech do not include this detail. Aftermath. The Crusader states after the First Crusade. The First Crusade succeeded in establishing the Crusader states of Edessa, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Tripoli in Palestine and Syria, as well as allies along the Crusaders' route, such as the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. Back at home in Western Europe, those who had survived to reach Jerusalem were treated as heroes. Robert of Flanders was nicknamed Hierosolymatangus thanks to his exploits. The life of Godfrey of Bouillon became legendary even within a few years of his death. In some cases, the political situation at home was greatly affected by Crusader absences. For instance, while Robert Curthose was away on crusade, the throne of England had passed to his brother Henry I of England instead, and their resultant conflict led to the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106. Meanwhile, the establishment of the Crusader states in the east helped ease Seljuk pressure on the Byzantine Empire, which had regained some of its Anatolian territory with Crusader help, and experienced a period of relative peace and prosperity in the 12th century. The effect on the Muslim dynasties of the east was gradual but important. In the wake of the death of Malik Shah I in 1092, political instability and the division of the Great Seljuk Empire prevented a coherent defense against the Latin states. Cooperation between them remained difficult for many decades, but from Egypt to Syria to Baghdad there were calls for the expulsion of the Crusaders, culminating in the recapture of Jerusalem under Saladin later in the century when the Ayyubids had united the surrounding areas. Inspiration to the future. The success of the Crusade inspired the literary imagination of poets in France, who, in the 12th century, began to compose various chansons de geste celebrating the exploits of Godfrey of Bouillon and other crusaders. Some of these, such as the Chanson d'Antiochie, are semi-historical, while others are completely fanciful, describing battles with a dragon or connecting Godfrey's ancestors to the legend of the Knight of the Swan. Together, the chansons are known as the Crusade cycle. The First Crusade was also an inspiration to artists in later centuries. In 1580, Torquato Tasso wrote Jerusalem Delivered, a largely fictionalized epic poem about the capture of Jerusalem. George Friedrich Handel composed music based on Tasso's poem in his opera Rinaldo. The 19th-century poet Tommaso Grossi also wrote an epic poem, which was the basis of Giuseppe Verdi's opera I Lombardi alla prima crociata. Thanks for watching to this video. Did you like this video and do you want more of this kind of videos? Like and subscribe.